I was looking at this photo of Mathieu Ricard recently. You know him, right? The French monk they call the happiest man in the world.
Oh, yeah, the one with all the sensors on his head.
That's the one. In the close-up, he looks exactly how you'd expect a sage to look. Serene, smiling, completely at peace. But then you zoom out, and the context changes entirely.
Right.
He isn't sitting under a Bodhi tree. He's got 256 sensors strapped to his skull, his brain being digitized and measured like a piece of hardware.
It's the ultimate juxtaposition, isn't it? Spiritual attainment meets big data.
Exactly. And it gets even stranger when you see where this certified happiness takes him. He ends up at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
Of course he does.
Picture that. A man representing the renunciation of worldly possessions, standing in a room full of the world's wealthiest, most power-hungry elites. And they are hanging on his every word.
They want the secret to inner peace, but they want it optimized. They want it scalable and, completely divorced from any structural change that might challenge their own power.
That visual contradiction, the maroon robes amidst the tailored suits, the spiritual peace being dissected by cold medical machinery, it just clicked something into place for me. It wasn't that these billionaires suddenly wanted traditional enlightenment.
Yeah.
It was that they realized happiness had become a metric, a utility, something that could be quantified, optimized, and ultimately manufactured. It raised a really disturbing question for me. Is the happiness we're all chasing actually our own? Or is it just another product designed to keep the machine running?
And that image, it really encapsulates the entire tension of our deep dive today. We are investigating the rise of the happiness industry, this fusion of science, tech, and commerce, and how this obsession with measuring and maximizing individual emotional states has unintentionally become a powerful tool for economic and social control.
So that's our mission then.
That's it. To understand how this focus often shifts the burden of systemic failures away from society, government, and corporations, and puts it firmly onto the individual's own psychological management.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've moved so far from philosophical contentment to a measurable score. If we're trying to understand how to put a number on joy, we have to go back to the source. Where does this impulse to quantify well-being even begin?
Well, we can trace this impulse directly back to the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically with the rise of utilitarianism.
And its champion, Jeremy Bentham.
Jeremy Bentham. The core idea of utilitarianism was simple, yet revolutionary for its time. The moral and political goal of society and governance should be maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
That sounds noble on the surface, but once you make greatest happiness the political benchmark, you have to find a way to count it, right? Otherwise, how do you decide between two competing policies?
Precisely. Bentham realized that if happiness was going to be the objective basis for moral and political legislation, it couldn't remain this vague, subjective feeling. It had to be objective and, most importantly, calculable.
So he actually tried to do the math.
He did. He developed something he called the philosophic calculus. And this wasn't just a metaphor. It was a genuine attempt to assign numerical values to sensations of pleasure and pain.
A literal 19th century pleasure and pain spreadsheet for social engineering.
Yeah.
I mean, that shows incredible ambition, if not a little hubris. How detailed did he get in these calculations?
Oh, extremely detailed. He wasn't satisfied with merely saying this makes people happy. He broke pleasure down into 7 quantifiable dimensions.
7, okay.
You have the straightforward ones: intensity, how strong is the pleasure, and duration, how long does it last?
That makes sense.
But then he moved into social prediction and aggregation, which is where it gets really interesting.
Give us some of the more complex ones.
Okay, so you have certainty. How likely is it that the action will actually produce the expected pleasure? And propinquity, which is just a fancy word for how soon will the pleasure arrive.
So it's about timing and risk assessment.
Exactly. Then come the social or relational dimensions: fecundity and purity.
Fecundity sounds almost biological, like it should breed more happiness.
That's pretty much the idea. Fecundity meant the likelihood that the pleasure will be followed by sensations of the same kind, a pleasure that breeds more pleasure.
Ah, so a virtuous cycle.
And purity was the opposite, the probability that the sensation won't be followed by sensations of the opposite kind. So minimizing pain or regret down the line. Finally, extent measured the number of people affected by it.
What's fascinating here is that Bentham viewed happiness not as this deep internal spiritual state, but as an aggregation of physical and neurological triggers that could be managed and predicted using pure rationality. It implies that if we just input the right stimulus, we get the desired emotional output.
And that is the profound impulse we have to appreciate. It was an early, aggressive step toward the rational, objective management of social welfare. It established the idea that inner subjective states could and should be quantified for the purpose of large-scale governance.
And that impulse to quantify inner feelings is the absolute prerequisite for the entire modern happiness industry.
It is.
And once philosophy set the stage, science rushed in to provide the instruments to refine those measurements beyond just philosophical speculation. This is where psychophysics enters the picture in the 19th century.
Absolutely. The problem with Bentham was that his calculus was purely theoretical. He didn't have the tools. Psychophysics tried to bridge that gap between the physical, measurable world of stimuli and the internal subjective experience of perception.
Right, so people like Gustav Fechner and Ernst Heinrich Weber.
Those are the key figures. They sought to find exact mathematical laws that connected physical stimulus magnitude to subjective psychological perception.
They were trying to build a scale for the soul, essentially, a ruler for internal feelings.
They were. They were seeking what they called the just noticeable difference, or J&D, in stimuli.
For instance,
how much brighter does a light have to be for a person to register that it has actually changed? Or how much heavier does a weight need to be before you perceive a difference in your hand?
And what did they find? Did they find a consistent pattern?
They did. They proposed these fundamental relationships, like Weber's law and later Fechner's law, which suggested that the perceived sensation is proportional to the logarithm of the physical stimulus.
Okay, logarithmic laws are not intuitive for most people, but what's the big implication there?
It means that to get a linear, step-by-step increase in subjective feeling, you need an exponential increase in physical energy. The more you have of something, the more you need to add to even notice a change.
So the implication is huge. They established that our inner subjective feelings can be described, predicted, and, quantified by mathematical formulas.
And this foundational belief is the intellectual bedrock that legitimizes the 1 to 10 happiness or satisfaction scales we see everywhere today. Without psychophysics establishing the notion that we can meaningfully transform a qualitative subjective experience into objective quantitative data, modern happiness surveys wouldn't be seen as scientifically credible.
That's a massive leap, though, isn't it? From measuring a difference in weight to measuring a difference in joy.
It's a colossal leap, but the methodological scaffolding was built by these 19th century scientists.
Okay, so we have the philosophical desire to measure happiness from Bentham and the scientific method for translating subjective experience into numbers from psychophysics. Here's where it gets really complicated. When this quantifiable happiness steps into the cold, calculating world of economics, economics historically avoided measuring how much satisfaction someone got, didn't it?
That's one of the great ironies here. Traditional economics post-Pareto largely rejected the idea of cardinal utility.
Cardinal utility being?
Cardinality assumes that you can measure the absolute amount of satisfaction, that you can say situation A is precisely twice as good as situation B. Since this was impossible to prove empirically or ethically, they settled for ordinal utility.
And ordinal utility is just simple preference ranking. I prefer a house to an apartment.
Yeah.
I prefer more money to less money. You can rank, but you can't measure the distance between the ranks.
Exactly. They could say you prefer apples to oranges, but not how much more. This allowed economists to model consumer choices without needing to dive into the messy, unmeasurable inner workings of the human mind. Everything was based on observing revealed preferences in the market.
But this new movement, happiness economics, which really took off in the late 20th century, is trying to drag cardinality right back in, using the very tools forged by psychophysics.
It is, and it's doing it through those simple survey questions. On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life? Happiness economics takes these self-reported scores and treats them as proxy measures for utility or satisfaction.
And then they use statistical models too.
What?
To figure out what makes the numbers go up or down.
They do. They use statistical methods, often latent variable models, to try and estimate indifference curves.
Let's pause on that technical part. What exactly is a latent variable model in this context, and why is it necessary?
A latent variable is something you can't observe directly, like overall life satisfaction. It's a hidden or latent concept. So instead of asking just one question, you might ask several related questions. How satisfied are you with your job, your family, your health? The latent variable model then uses the statistical covariance and patterns across all those observable answers to estimate a single unobserved score, which is supposed to represent the person's true underlying satisfaction level.
So you're using subjective self-reports to define an objective economic model of preference. They're creating these indifference curves, the combinations of income, health, and family factors that yield the same level of reported satisfaction.
Which then allows them to do something incredibly useful for policy: determine compensating variation.
What does that look like in policy practice? That's where the rubber meets the road.
It has major practical utility, especially in constructing policies like family equivalent scales. Because we can assume that individuals who rate their financial satisfaction as, say, a 7 mean are equally satisfied, regardless of their family structure.
Yeah.
We can then calculate how much compensating income is needed to offset a change in circumstances, like adding a child or losing a spouse.
That seems like a powerful way to ground policy in the actual stated experience of the population, rather than just arbitrary assumptions made by experts in a room somewhere.
It provides an objective, welfare-neutral benchmark. For instance, researchers have used the satisfaction data to calculate family equivalence scales, determining the monetary value of family size changes.
And what did they find?
The data suggests that a couple with one child would need approximately 13% more net income to maintain the exact same level of financial satisfaction they had before increasing their family size.
13%. That is a concrete number derived not from a committee arguing about the cost of diapers, but from thousands of people reporting their sense of financial well-being. That sounds revolutionary for welfare design.
It is. It's the strength of the method. But the moment you start scaling this up, comparing happiness between entire nations, or calculating national metrics like gross national happiness or, happiness inequality, you run headfirst into the primary methodological hurdle.
The assumption of cardinality.
The assumption of cardinality.
The assumption that the distance between the numbers is equal.
Exactly. You must assume that the difference in satisfaction between reporting a 6 and a 7 is the precise mathematical equivalent of the difference between an 8 and a 9.
Which we have no way of knowing.
We don't. If the individual who reports a 9 has a much broader, richer concept of what a 10 even means than the individual who reports a 6 foot, then your calculations of gross national happiness and inequality are fundamentally flawed. This is a giant, unavoidable leap of faith when you move from individual-level analysis to national comparisons.
And even if we accept that leap, this data hits some serious internal contradictions when we look at long-term effects. We know the economy is designed to motivate us toward ever-increasing consumption and income, but does that actually translate into long-term utility gains?
No, because we're not static creatures who simply absorb wealth. We adapt.
Right.
And this is where economists observe two critical phenomena that seriously undermine the long-term utility of economic policy focused purely on monetary compensation. These concepts are crucial to understanding why the pursuit of happiness becomes this moving target.
Let's start with the internal adaptation, the famous hedonic treadmill.
That's what economists call preference drift. When your income rises, your norms shift. Your aspirations, your perceived needs, your baseline for what constitutes a good life, it all increases accordingly. You quickly adapt to your new salary, your bigger house, or your luxury car.
And the initial spike in satisfaction just fades.
It rapidly fades back toward the original baseline. We run faster and faster, but we stay in the same place, hedonically speaking.
Yeah. I think we've all experienced that. That initial thrill of a big purchase or a raise lasts maybe 6 weeks, if you're lucky, and then you're just used to it. Your reference point has moved.
And then compounding that internal adaptation is the external comparison. Reference drift. It's often called comparison income.
The keeping up with the Joneses effect.
Precisely. Your satisfaction is not solely based on your absolute income, but intensely on how your income compares to your neighbors, your colleagues, your peers, your social media feed.
Everywhere.
If everyone in your reference group gets richer, your satisfaction can actually decrease, even if your own income stays the same. The absolute gain is psychologically negated by the relative loss.
So you might have a higher salary than ever before, but if your neighbor just bought a yacht, your subjective satisfaction score might dip.
It very well might.
So we adapt to our new wealth internally, and then we immediately start comparing ourselves to others who are doing better externally. It's a double whammy that almost guarantees the long-term utility of purely financial gains will be marginal at best.
That is the conclusion of the research. The combined effect of preference drift, which is adaptation, and reference drift, which is comparison, nearly neutralizes the long-term utility gains of monetary compensation. Studies show that people who win the lottery, while happier in the short term, eventually revert close to their pre-lottery happiness levels.
And that renders the long-term effectiveness of certain economic policies, which are fundamentally built on the assumption that more wealth increases welfare, highly questionable.
Extremely questionable.
So here's the massive contradiction we've landed on. We have this sophisticated, quantified metric that seems to mostly tell us that more money doesn't buy a lasting happiness, and yet the engine of modern global society is still powered by this relentless drive for profit, competition, and consumption.
Right.
Something has to explain the resulting unhappiness when the economic system fails to deliver on its promise. And this is where the critique gets political, linking happiness metrics directly to the neoliberal worldview.
This is the crucial transitional moment. If the economic structure of capitalism, competition, is proven ineffective at generating lasting satisfaction, but the entire structure relies on people continuing to participate, it needs a new way to explain widespread unhappiness. It has to shift the blame away from the system itself.
And that's where the neoliberal framework steps in, reframing not just the economy, but society and the individual within it.
The critique posits that the modern happiness pursuit is deeply intertwined with this neoliberal framework. And when we say neoliberalism here, we mean a worldview where society is viewed as a universal competitive market.
And every individual is an entrepreneur.
Every individual is conceptualized not just as a worker, but as an entrepreneur, focused on maximizing personal monetary wealth, efficiency, and continuous self-improvement.
So it's not just an economic policy of deregulation and privatization. It's a total reshaping of personal identity.
Absolutely. The defining metaphor is the self as personal property. Just as early liberal theory recognized the right to own land and capitalize on it, the modern neoliberal self is seen as a portfolio or a resource that must be constantly mined for valuable human capital.
So we're urged to invest in our skills, optimize our performance, and put our emotional resources, our resilience, our grit into circulation. Our social value is determined by our competitive market worth.
It is.
Okay, so if I'm an entrepreneur of the self and I fail to find happiness or financial stability, if my personal corporation doesn't turn a profit, or if my emotional balance sheet is constantly showing red, the system has a remarkably convenient explanation for that failure.
The consequence is that failure in this hyper-competitive market is instantly pathologized as a personal deficit. We stop seeing collective problems as political, economic, or managerial failures and start seeing them as mental health issues or character flaws.
You call them anxiety, depression, burnout.
Or simply a lack of grit. Scholar George Monbiot put it starkly. The oppressed worker is turned into a self-exploiting worker in their own enterprise. If you fail, you internalize that failure, blame yourself, and feel intense shame for your lack of merit or resilience.
It's the ultimate responsibility shift. The core criticism, highlighted by researchers like Whitman, is simple. When you are unhappy or stressed, the systemic problem, your sky-high rent, the meager paycheck, the unreasonable workload is ignored. The problem is seen as you.
The problem is you. You lack the psychological tools to cope.
And that is where the story of Elena, the logistics coordinator, comes into sharp focus. This is a perfect, tangible illustration of what happens when a structural problem meets the neoliberal happiness playbook.
So Elena works for a major shipping firm. She faces chronic, debilitating stress. Why?
It's not internal.
No. Her rent has increased 40% in 5 years, forcing her into a tiny, poorly insulated apartment far from work. Simultaneously, her department has been chronically understaffed since a cost-cutting measure eliminated 3 positions last year. She is constantly working 10-hour days and feels physical exhaustion and panic when her alarm goes off.
These are external, economic, and managerial pressures.
Yeah.
Any rational person would be stressed. It's an appropriate response.
Exactly. Her problem requires structural solutions, higher wages, more staff, affordable housing advocacy by the city. But instead of addressing those root causes, what does the company do?
They announce a wellness initiative.
A wellness initiative. They mandate that all staff attend a seminar on grit and resilience, followed by a year-long subscription to a corporate-approved mindfulness app.
So her stress is rebranded. It's no longer a valid response to an exploitative situation. It's a failure of her personal psychological infrastructure. She needs to be more resilient.
Her fatigue is reframed as a failure of mindset that she, the entrepreneur of the self, must personally manage and optimize. This is the resilience trap. The intervention demands that Alina spend her limited free time trying to find her center using this app.
Rather than spending that time looking for a better job, organizing with colleagues, or demanding fairer scheduling.
It effectively diverts her energy and attention away from demanding structural solutions and encourages her to tackle her stress through solitary self-management. And you can see why the corporation loves this.
Of course. It's much cheaper and easier to buy 1,000 app subscriptions than to hire 5 full-time coordinators.
And this move successfully privatizes social ills. It makes people blame their own lack of merit, their lack of psychological resilience, or their poor meditation habits instead of challenging the root causes. It justifies systemic inequality by suggesting that the poor or the stressed simply haven't optimized their inner resources sufficiently.
So why offer improved healthcare benefits, raise the minimum wage, or tackle housing inequality when you can just teach mindfulness classes to exhausted workers instead?
It is a massive win for corporate interests. It shifts the burden of adaptation entirely onto the employee, allowing the core business model of maximizing efficiency and minimizing labor costs to continue completely unchallenged.
And this need for happy, compliant individuals spills directly into the workplace because there's a proven financial incentive. This is why the happiness industry is so vast. It's not just about self-help books anymore.
No, we're talking about an entire commercial landscape that services this idea of the self-optimizing individual. It includes the coaching sector, wellness retreats, specialized apps, and critically, the medicalization of emotion.
The market size must be staggering.
It is, and it's all built on the premise that your emotional state is a product you must consume and manage to maintain.
The medicalization point is perhaps the most concerning, especially when you consider the pharmaceutical industry's role in defining what even counts as unhappiness.
Well, the research highlights how the healthcare industry, particularly in the U.S., has strong interlocking interests with the pharmaceutical sector. The critique notes that the process of defining disorders, such as those listed in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is often influenced by individuals who have financial ties to drug companies.
So this relationship risks swinging the psychiatric focus toward individual, biologically based diagnoses, a chemical imbalance, for which drugs are then proposed as the primary and often only treatment.
In this paradigm, the individual's psychological state becomes a target for capital accumulation. Disorders are defined into existence, or their definitions are broadened explicitly to expand the market for drugs. If you're unhappy, you're pathologized, and then you're monetized.
You're not allowed to be angry at the system, you must be productive, and if you can't manage your stress with an app, there's a pill for that personal failure too.
And this desire for happy, compliant individuals is backed by hard data for corporations. The 12% productivity stat is always cited, isn't it?
Always. Research confirms that happy workers are demonstrably 12% more productive than unhappy ones. This isn't just theory, it's bottom-line data driving corporate adoption of these happiness programs.
And it reframes wellness not as a humanitarian goal, but as an investment tool for profit maximization.
Which moves us into the surveillance state of the corporate office. If happiness is a metric tied to productivity, companies have to measure and manage that sentiment constantly. How far does this management go beyond just mandatory yoga or casual surveys?
It goes much, much further. Beyond standard methods like pulse surveys and office perks, companies are increasingly relying on advanced technological methods to monitor and manage emotional input. We are seeing the utilization of algorithms embedded in corporate software to monitor employee sentiment through emails, instant messages, and even sometimes social media activity linked to corporate accounts.
So if I write an email to a colleague expressing frustration, an algorithm might flag that as low sentiment, and that score feeds into my overall performance profile. That is incredibly intrusive.
It is. This effectively creates a surveillance workplace where employees are being graded on their perceived mood and compliance. And the core critique is that these programs prioritize corporate interests, maximizing profits, reducing sick days, ensuring compliance over genuine employee welfare.
And it risks creating a high-pressure environment where employees feel compelled to constantly project positivity. They become emotional actors, performing happy to avoid a negative metric on their internal profile, suppressing any genuine exhaustion or ethical conflicts they might be feeling.
The authentic self is replaced by the optimized performative self. And this brings us directly to what critics call the tyranny of positivity.
Right. If the corporate world and the wellness industry demand relentless cheer, what happens to those necessary complex or even negative human emotions?
They become defined as defects that must be instantly fixed.
They're not allowed.
No. The tyranny of the positive dictates that negative feelings, anger, sorrow, doubt, anxiety are abnormal psychological defects. They are not viewed as valid responses to structural injustice or personal loss. They are just glitches in the system that need to be eliminated or pathologized. And this is where positivity is weaponized as a form of social control.
The story about David in the Customer Support Center illustrates this perfectly, where moral outrage is treated as a psychological pathology. Let's spend some time on David's situation to really understand the mechanism of control here.
Okay, so David worked for a large financial services company. In his customer support role, he discovered, through repeated calls, that the company was systematically committing mild fraud against elderly customers.
Things like minor fees being added or necessary services being withheld.
Exactly. His anger was righteous. It was a valid moral and ethical response demanding justice for vulnerable people.
And that anger should be the catalyst for him to report the fraud to regulators or to senior management. It's the engine for change.
It should be. But because the company has a pervasive positive vibes-only corporate culture designed to maintain high productivity metrics, the HR director ignores the issue of the fraud entirely.
They're not focused on the crime.
They're focused on maintaining the emotional stability of the team. David is pulled aside not for whistleblowing, but because his visible distress, his moral anger, is perceived as a threat to the measured harmony of the office.
And what did the HR director say to him?
He was told that his negative energy was creating a toxic atmosphere and lowering the team's overall happiness score on the daily internal pulse survey.
Unbelievable.
His moral reaction was pathologized as a personal flaw. He wasn't penalized for his knowledge, but for his emotional presentation. He was then ordered to attend mandatory emotional regulation coaching to manage his volatile feelings.
That is profound. His anger, the natural fuel for fixing a serious ethical failure, is diverted from external action and directed inward for therapeutic intervention. The system silences dissent not through overt censorship, but through therapy, framing moral reaction as personal illness.
And this is a critical point that the sources emphasize. It really echoes concerns about the therapeutic state's overreach and the deconstruction of traditional social structures, replacing civic engagement with psychological management.
Right. Mandated happiness in this context prevents critical engagement with reality.
It forces conformity and compliance instead of allowing for necessary calls for justice and accountability. It suppresses the emotional complexity required for ethical life because sadness, anger, and moral outrage are often the most accurate responses to a deeply flawed world.
And this relentless need to measure and quantify everything doesn't just silence necessary anger. It seems to drain the value out of things that were precious, precisely because they couldn't be measured. This speaks to the metric of the soul.
The relentless quantification of well-being leads directly to the superficialization of the human experience. When everything must be reduced to a score, even our deepest bonds and commitments, we risk losing the value that exists entirely outside the spreadsheet. We mistake the measurement for the meaning.
And the more we rely on these metrics, the more we feel pressured to manage our entire lives as a series of inputs designed to produce measurable emotional outputs. The anecdote about Mark and Jiwoo, the biohacker, and his partner, makes this concept feel chillingly real.
Mark is the epitome of the quantified self movement. He is obsessed with biohacking and tracking every possible metric of his life. He interrupts a deep, organic conversation with his partner, Jiwoo, not because of an emergency, but to check his wrist-mounted tracker.
To check his data.
To monitor his stress markers in real time.
So he's not present in the relationship. He's analyzing his physiological data stream during the relationship.
And the conclusion is equally distorting. Later, he compliments Jiwoo not with a heartfelt expression of affection, but by informing her, quite proudly, that their relationship yields a net positive of 12% on his personal happiness index.
Wow. He is offering a high score as an endearment. He has reduced their complex, messy, unquantifiable bond, which must contain struggle, friction, and compromise, not just bliss to mere data points.
He's quantifying the magic, the spontaneity, the unruliness of human connection.
And this demonstrates the erosion of value. When human experiences, like love, friendship, or commitment, are reduced to spreadsheet data, we risk losing the inherent value they possess. The focus shifts from authentic connection and shared experience to simply optimizing the score.
The preoccupation with tracking and optimizing leads to a superficialization of life, reducing messy, organic, unquantifiable bonds to key performance indicators.
And, this also touches upon deeper cultural anxieties, echoing concerns about a kind of woke culture that overmanages emotional vocabulary and social interactions, making organic social bonds feel increasingly precarious or easily pathologized if they deviate from an approved emotional script.
That tension is undeniable. When every feeling must be categorized, labeled, and optimized, the spontaneous reality of human connection just disappears. We end up in a system where only the measurable is valued, leading us to overinvest our energy in activities that yield a clear score, even if those activities are ultimately shallow, while neglecting the deep, complex parts of life that cannot be tracked or graphed.
So if the modern industrial approach to happiness is fundamentally flawed, if it is based on this problematic neoliberal metaphor of the self as property that must be mined and optimized, what is the alternative? How do we reclaim genuine connection and agency outside of the metrics?
The alternative requires a fundamental deconstruction of this individualistic worldview, which is exactly what therapeutic practices like narrative therapy propose. We have to confront the metaphor of the self as property directly.
So let's go back to the resilience trap. We discussed how accepting a label like resilient as an internal possession is dangerous. Why does narrative therapy challenge those identity conclusions?
When we accept resilience or grit or even lazy as an internal possession or a personal property that we manage, we support a politics of haves and have-nots.
Right.
Institutions love it because they can demand more of the resilient people and dismiss the struggles of those who lack the property of resilience as a personal deficit. Narrative therapy works to unpack these identity conclusions and locate them not inside the person, but within history, relationship, and social context.
So instead of labeling a person as being resilient, what should we focus on? What's the change in the linguistic framing?
We shift from identity conclusions to what are called intentional state understandings. This moves the focus away from internal qualities that people have, like resilience, and towards the hopes, dreams, desires, and commitments that words like resilient reference. Crucially, it asks us to trace the relationships, actions, and histories that enabled them to demonstrate that skill.
So instead of asking Elena, how can you be more resilient? We would ask, who taught you that skill of endurance? When did you first realize you could handle that stress? And who is standing with you or supporting you when you demonstrated that ability?
Exactly. This actively promotes mutual support and interdependence over individual possessiveness. By tracing the alliances and relationships that made an action possible, we develop new, richer stories where those abilities are experienced as relational rather than purely individual property. This helps people step out of the isolated, competitive mindset of corporation of one and into a world of mutual support.
This sounds like a philosophical change, but it also has very practical applications for building community and shared purpose. What specific collective practices support this shift away from the individualizing happiness narrative?
Narrative practice emphasizes linking lives through shared purposes, often creating external collective documents that prove the problem is social, not internal. Two powerful methods are the formation of leagues and the creation of collective documents.
Tell us more about the leagues. That sounds fascinating.
David Epstein, one of the founders of narrative therapy, facilitated the formation of groups like the Anti-Anorexia, Anti-Bulimia League. These leagues function as spaces where members share insider knowledge and art about their struggles, effectively proving to individuals that their problem is socio-cultural and political, not some unique internal failed pathology.
That immediately alleviates the deep shame and isolation caused by the neoliberal framing. If I join a league, I realize I'm not a failed individual. I'm part of a large group responding to a cultural pressure.
It externalizes the problem. It replaces the isolating question, what is wrong with me, with the collaborative question, what is wrong with the discourse that we are fighting?
And the collective documents, how do they function as practical tools against this tide of individualism?
The collective documents practice involves groups compiling shared wisdom about coping mechanisms or struggles, gathering what people have hard-earned knowledge about overcoming a specific problem. For example, one such document, titled Changing Our Relationships with Fear and Worry, included individuals contributing actionable relational coping strategies.
What kind of insights come out of compiling that kind of collective wisdom that we don't get from a standardized mindfulness app?
They contain practical, deeply relational wisdom that counters the competitive, monetized logic of the happiness industry. For instance, an entry might suggest that countering worry is not about breathing exercises, but about deliberately prioritizing human connection.
So, a concrete example.
One concrete insight from the document was a strategy for countering financial worry by stating aloud, relationships are more important than money, and then questioning whether your daily choices actually align with that value.
That advice is inherently anti-neoliberal. It demands you prioritize interdependence over competitive accumulation.
It is entirely focused on the relational economy rather than the monetary one. These documents help people break free from the feeling of being a corporation of one by circulating stories of inclusion, interdependence, and collective coping. They provide a sense of solidarity in history, demonstrating that your current capacity to cope is always built on alliances and shared knowledge, not solitary psychological grit.
So where does this leave us?
I think the historical drive to measure happiness, from Bentham's calculus to psychophysics, provided important, measurable insights for economics and policy design. We can't deny that. However, in its modern, commercialized, and neoliberal form, it has become deeply problematic. When governments and corporations employ these metrics, the singular pursuit of optimal happiness often results in the internalization of systemic failures and the suppression of authentic human complexity in favor of compliance, productivity, and profitability. We must recognize the political and economic forces driving the demand for quantifiable bliss, understanding that the tools of measurement can easily become the instruments of control.
The knowledge derived from this deep dive is the understanding that true fulfillment may not be achieved through solitary optimization or chasing a perfect score in a dashboard, but in embracing the full, complex range of human emotion, including the necessary, meaningful sadness or the righteous anger David felt. Real well-being is intrinsically connected not just to our personal ability to regulate our mood, but to the collaborative efforts we make to create a world less in need of constant, mandatory resilience, grounded in collective fairness and solidarity.